It was almost just chopped off right when it was getting good. It's like, really? Right when they're getting good, right when they're getting fun, they pull the plug on the team. It was very, very depressing.
And it wasn't just like it was the shock and disbelief of it. It was like what they had done to our team. That this wonderful spider's web had been constructed so delicately and intricately, and it was just ripped down, and it was done. It was finished. And it was heartbreaking for us as a group. Because some amazing memories, oh man, some amazing memories. They just felt they lost faith, I guess. And it's like being told by your first love, I don't love you anymore. I don't love you. You know, there's somebody else.
There's a hardcore group that has been begging for the last 12 years to please bring a team here. I really believe MLS will be back in Miami. And I think that everyone involved learned what kind of team would get this audience excited.
And it was going to a game knowing that you weren't just going to see a game of football. You were going to be purely entertained. Because if that doesn't turn you on, if that team doesn't get your heart and say that's what the game's about, nothing will.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Thank you, Corey Coates, and welcome one and all to the show that never ends. It's Good Seats, still available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us, downloading us, putting us in your earbuds, whatever you're doing to ingest this week's fun and frivolity. We have both of those for you this week as we circle around one of the two first ever expansion franchises in Major League Soccer history back in 1998, along with the Chicago Fire, who still exist. The Miami Fusion. 4 years of the Miami Fusion is the subject of our Miami Fusion Roundtable this week with our guests, Joe Shaw, John Trask, former coach, and Jim Rooney, former player for the Miami Fusion. Joe Shaw, the chief instigator of this, is the host and producer of the awesome new podcast series called 25 for 25, the story of the Miami Fusion. Give it a listen. Some great episodes already and plenty more in the hopper. This is a labor of love for Joe and those who have chosen to also participate. They go deep into this interesting situation in Major League Soccer's history. This was a team that only existed for 4 years, but it won the Supporter Shield, or it wasn't even called the Supporter Shield back then, in 2001, their last season. And you heard a little bit of sort of the wistfulness of the end, the demise of this team. 2001, Miami Fusion won the league championship, the regular season league championship. They bowed out in the semifinals of the playoffs. But by all accounts, they were, and frankly, historically, still revered as perhaps, arguably, one of the best teams to ever play in Major League Soccer. They finished the 2001 season with a 16-5-5 record. And they played you would argue, the beautiful game. And Ray Hudson, who was the coach that season and partially the year before, is an integral part of the Miami Fusion's story and that, let's call it, championship season. And as you heard in that clip, it was a kind of unceremonious end to the Miami Fusion's not only 2001 season by losing out in the playoffs, but it was a contraction year. You have to remember that after this season was complete, there were the horrific events of September 2001 that occurred, of course, during as this would be sort of during the playoffs, or actually just before the playoffs began. And the economy was not doing very well, and it was a whole bunch of changes in Major League Soccer's early history, right? Starting in 1996, it was now 2001. It was bleeding, hemorrhaging money, and one of the changes that was brought to bear was to contract both the Fusion and the Tampa Bay Mutiny at that time. 2 steps backward, if you will, to go forward. And now we almost forget that period of time here in May of 2023, when we literally have just seen the announcement of its 30th franchise in Major League Soccer, a team that will be domiciled in San Diego, and with, in all likelihood, probably 2 more teams to come in the next couple of years. I cannot imagine there will be another round of expansion when 2026 rolls around. The World Cup is here, and all the hype and hysteria of the world game probably generating even more interest, economy notwithstanding. But the task at hand this week is a roundtable conversation. We're going to talk about the short history, the colorful characters, people like Doug Hamilton, and of course Ray Hudson, the players' coach, if there ever was one. The old Lockhart Stadium is part of this. Diego Serna, if you remember him, tearing it up in 2001. In actually 98, 99, and 2000. He played in 2001 as well. Diego Serna was the team's leading goal scorer for the first 3 years of its existence. Alex Pineda Chacon had 19 goals, led the league, I think, that year in 2001. He makes a virtual appearance. And lots of great stories, lots of great anecdotes, and again, some truly fun reminiscences. And, we even talk about sort of the legacy, right? The Fort Lauderdale Strikers that came before them in Lockhart Stadium there. And, of course, Inter Miami, the team that now exists in Major League Soccer, a return to that market. And the Miami Fusion's role in, I guess, kind of connecting those two, the NASL Strikers and today's MLS Inter Miami franchise. One, and we cannot forget the Miami Fusion and the role that they played in keeping pro soccer alive and thriving, at least for that period of time in between those two extremes. So we're going to get into all of that with Joe Shaw, John Trask, and Jim Rooney in just a few moments' time. They all participants in the 2425 podcast that Joe has been producing. You can find that wherever podcasts are found. And before we get there, I do want to shout out one of our great sponsors. Of course, that's sportshistorycollectibles.com. And that's our pal Dean Mitchell in San Diego, who is ecstatic at the fact that Major League Soccer is finally coming to San Diego after a long drought. Obviously, the San Diego Union of USL has existed for a couple of years. The San Diego Sockers soldier on in the major arena soccer league and all that legacy. But the Sockers, the San Diego Sockers of the old NASL, used to play in the old Jack Murphy Stadium. Well, a lot of memories could keep coming, just running right back to Dean and all of his pals there. And you go to search up at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Not only will you find tremendous memorabilia from those San Diego Sockers in various forms, but also to the delight of our listeners this week, there's a wonderful Miami Fusion 2001 media guide. And boy, that's the guide to get. Not only was it their last ever media guide, but that was the one that kind of is sort of the backdrop to their championship, or at least regular season supporter shield, although it wasn't called that back then, winning performance, the Miami Fusion. You can find that Miami Fusion 2001 media guide among zillions of other memorabilia items from all kinds of different sports and leagues. It's memorabilia of all those leagues that thrived or failed and shaped the North American sports landscape of today. And the Miami Fusion is no exception. You can find that and many, many other great items at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Take a peek. You're going to enjoy the search. You're going to enjoy the thrill of finding stuff. The photography is wonderful. You'll know what kind of stuff you're getting. It's high quality stuff. There's new stuff there just about every other week. And of course, when you decide to purchase an item or 2 or 10, make sure that you use the promo code GOODSEATS to ensure 15% right off that total, courtesy of Dean and us at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Promo code GOODSEATS, 15% off. Visit them early, visit them often, and you'll be better for it for sure. Just all kinds of great stuff. Miami Fusion stuff. There's a Miami Fusion pennant that just recently sold, and I'm sure more items to come. Check them out. The Good Seats still available. I was going to say, we're going to promote the website again, our website. Forget it. sportshistorycollectibles.com, promo code Good Seats. Thank you, Dean, and thank you all for checking them out for sure. All right, let's get out of our tongue-tiedness here and get into a tremendous conversation, a wonderful discussion about the good old days of the Miami Fusion. Let's talk about that team in South Florida. It had some great memories, some great uniforms, and here's our conversation we had just a week and a half ago. Please, as always, enjoy. The Miami Fusion, of course, sort of fits right in because this was a very interesting existence for, albeit only 4 seasons, in the earliest days of MLS. Lots of intrigue as to how it came about, what it kind of set in place, some of the things that have come from it and arguably need to be credited to, and frankly, its demise, which is all part of the fabric and the story. And I think a lot of even current generation of fans, right, don't even remember the mutiny of Tampa Bay or the Miami Fusion or some of the even original names of some of the teams that's still around. But Joe, let me start with you, and then we'll layer in Jim and John to kind of introduce themselves. But
Sure.
You're the sort of chief corraller here of this thing. Tell us why we're here, because I just listened to a couple of episodes this week, and it's really cool. So why don't you give us a background and the setup and what it is?
Sure. So I think the best way to do that is to explain how I fell in love with the game of soccer to begin with. So my dad started working for the Dallas Burn. There's the throwback back in 1996, and started bringing the whole family to volunteer because at the time, it was a family affair. Everybody chipped in and volunteered. So I started volunteering in 1998. 25 years ago as a ball kid.
At the old Cotton Bowl, right?
At the old Cotton Bowl, that's right. And the first game I was a ball kid for was an 8-1 loss to the LA Galaxy. But the one goal that Dallas scored was an Olympico by Damian Alvarez, and it was the net that I was behind. So that was my first exposure to soccer, and I fell in love ever since. So for me, MLS was where I first started following the game and fell in love with it. So fast forward, MLS has always been my preferred league that I follow and am fascinated with. And so I know Jim's brother, Al, pretty well. I met Jim through Al. And when I was looking at telling stories, because I love to tell stories, I've done various podcast projects. I've been wanting to do more sports stories. And so when looking at the timing of MLS doing a big Apple deal, there's rumblings about, this guy named Lionel Messi possibly coming over, lots of chatter in the league. And we got the 2026 World Cup coming up. It felt very fortuitous to tell a story about the history of MLS, because I feel that the more that a league like MLS grows, the less new fans know about the history and the fabric of the league. And the more I dug into the Miami Fusion, which in my opinion was the best team and the most exciting team that ever played in MLS, I would say, not arguably, that's my personal opinion. The more I realized how much the players, the staff, the coaches impacted the foundation of the league. I mean, Garth Lagerwey, I just did an episode with him. And, he was a backup goalkeeper for 2 years, but he got advice and perspective from GM Doug Hamilton, which informed a lot of decisions he's made as an executive through the years. So without Garth coming to Miami and learning with Doug, you may not have the success you see in Salt Lake or Seattle, and maybe yet to come in Atlanta. So there you go.
And who have you brought along with you? Two folks from your podcast series. By the way, you didn't mention the name of the podcast series.
Oh, yes. The Rookie Mistake 101 right there. So yes, the podcast is called 25 for 25, the story of the Miami Fusion from those who lived it. And because 2023, March 15th, 2023 was 25 years exactly from the very first game that the Miami Fusion ever played, a 2-0 loss to DC United at Lockhart Stadium. I felt it was very fortuitous to do a bit of an oral history of the team from those that were involved in it. So the goal is to do 25 interviews across 25 episodes to chart the 25-year anniversary. And who have joined me today is Jim Rooney. I mentioned him a moment ago. So he was the perennial captain of the Fusion from 99 through 2001. And then John Trask, who is one of the assistant coaches for the Fusion that joined when Ray Hudson took the role of head coach in 2000 and then 2001 season.
So, Jim, I guess you were the earliest of the two here to sort of get brought into the Fusion fold. What was your pathway into the Fusion? Was it the super draft? It probably wasn't even a super draft at that point, right? Or how did you get into this MLS thing? It was only 2 years old when the Miami Fusion came around.
Yeah, it was a weird time, because a lot of us as players, we were always waiting for this league, and you heard stories about it's coming, and it finally came. But the league minimum wage was $24,000. And so a lot of players like myself who had a job, I was a little older, I wasn't coming out of college, it was a real decision for me, because I was working construction, learning. I was a third-year apprentice at Local 3 in the electricians union, and then I was also in the carpenters union at one stage. So I had to make a decision of, is this going to be worth it? Because at the time when the soccer was on, we all played before MLS was USISL, and that was mostly like we got paid 7 months, and we got paid 7 months because we made the playoffs. So it was a great second job for me at the time. So the first 2 years I didn't really go there to the MLS because it just wasn't worth it for me. I just couldn't afford to go. And then the year prior to 98, the Rough Riders, we played New England in the US Open Cup and the quarterfinals, and we ended up, I think it was the quarterfinals that got us to the semifinals, but we beat them 4-3. I scored 2 goals, and it was a big win for our club. And so it kind of got the juices flowing. And then our coach ended up going to the Metro Stars the following year, and he brought me along. And then my path down to Miami Fusion, I ended up, after my first year playing there, I was released. That's a story in itself, because they fired that coach and they brought on Bora Milutinovic, who for me was a disaster. And it was proven.
So you played for both Eddie Firmani and for Bora?
No. I didn't play for Alfonso Mondello.
Oh, sorry. Firmani was even the first one. So
Correct. You're right.
Here we are, third year of the franchise. You're in your third coach. Sorry.
Yeah, pretty much, right? But that's the way it was too at the time. So I ended up going down to Miami after I was actually released, and they picked me up there. And then from there, I was basically, I seen it all from there, because I actually got released on April Fool's Day, April 1st. So when I came down there, I was there from that day, the second part of the season on. And, I've seen it built. And like you said, Joe mentioned he spoke with Garth and, Doug Hamilton. I mean, since Joe has brought this Fusion thing up to us, it's kind of, there's things that you forget. And it's made me, just listen to Chacon and John's interviews, and you're like, it's a different perspective. And it triggers other thoughts, and it really made me think about Doug Hamilton a great deal. And Ray gets all the accolades, and he should. Ray is Ray. Ray was the man. But there's no Ray
Hudson. For our listeners, Ray Hudson, who you're referring to.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So explain. Why don't you explain also about Doug Hamilton, because he was a seminal figure in the early days of MLS for sure, and one of those people I think that sadly, it's going to take a few more years for people to kind of look back and really understand the history and stuff, and really recognize just how fundamental and foundational he was as part of those early days, which were there were no guarantees, were there?
No, and that's the thing with Doug. I mean, there's no Ray without Doug Hamilton. I mean, Doug had the ability to have a vision, and he was right. He rarely made mistakes, but he's the one that got Ray to come in, because Ray was the community director for us, and he was also like announcing for us initially. And those two put the whole thing together. And Doug Hamilton brought John in, and then he did things. He was for the players, and I'll give you an example as to why. Money. If you did well, you wanted to be rewarded. Everybody wanted to be rewarded, and then at times it was difficult the way they structured contracts and everything. But what Doug said was, during my contract, he had said, you deserve more, but you're tied into this contract. He goes, but maybe, he taught us how to read contracts, and he never told us, but he hinted, and it was basically things like, instead of, you start your first 4 games, you get a certain amount of money. It was like, just change the wording to 75% of the games, and you could have a new contract. I mean, it was all those kind of things where he just helped everything along. He knew everything. When I really think about all the little things that he helped us along the way, and again, I'm convinced, with Doug at the helm, everyone says, "Hey, how would you guys think you would have done the following year?" I just believe with the people involved, we just would have got better.
John, before I drag you into this, I just want to ask Jim one sort of last question on this front. You hinted at it before. I mean, you're a New York guy, born and raised, right? And
Right.
I think it's lost on a certain generation of MLS fans, right? That in the beginning years, of this league, 8 teams and then 10 with Miami and Tampa Bay coming aboard in 98. You're really sort of highlighting a financial sort of fork in the road, right? I mean, at once you're sort of seeing the fruition of all these rumors and the wake of the World Cup and all that kind of stuff, a real professional league. It's been, 10, 15 years since the death of the NASL. But yet the reality is that, you've been sort of in that sort of in that middle point when there was, smaller levels of pro soccer that were sort of limping along, but financially, right. You also were pulled by the fact that you got to pay bills, right? You got to get a career going. You got to, and I guess the real tension there is, how do you justify making the jump? I guess the Metro Stars at the time, not so hard of a jump because they were a local team essentially, but how do you make that? How do you further that commit by saying, I'm going to go to Miami now for the next step of my career? I mean, there's probably not only a leap of faith, but also a real tightening of the budget belt. No,
Big time. And it was a leap of faith, but you at the time, I guess we're so stupid, and being young and not. I mean, I thought about it, but at the same time, you're looking. I don't want to be. And, my wife said to me, I don't want to be 40 years of age and looking at you saying I could have played, and it was just that simple where, okay, if I'm going to do this, there's no half-assing it. You got to go full tilt into it. And I did. And, you have to get breaks along the way, and that's a big part of it. But I mean, some of the contracts that they were throwing around, by the time you signed your first contract, it was 24, then it was like 26 and then $27,000, for the non-essential. That was for the middle of the road, like the journeyman. And you just can't live on that. So what I did is I went later, and I was, back then they called it a designated player. I was able to get a little bit more, and I was able to get, they were able to match the salary that I got. That I wanted, because I went to preseason without a contract with the Metro Stars. And we were there 6 weeks, and we ended up playing, and I was scoring goals there. and I was a local kid. So obviously, the writers, my timing was just really good, and we ended up playing AC Milan. We lost 3-1. I scored the goal. Little things were just happening to go my way during there, and so from there, I was just like, let's go. I had a little bit of pull, and I was able to get a decent contract back then. But yeah, it was very difficult, and we knew that going in, though. I mean, honestly, for me, the age I wanted to be in there because then this was my avenue to become a coach. I wanted to be a coach. I wanted to be involved in the game, and honestly, that's one of the things with Doug Hamilton was saying to me. Listen, we keep going there. I would have moved probably into one of the assistant coaches or third assistant down the line. And that was my pathway. And then it was gone.
John, how about your entree? A little later, I guess Jim had already sort of been on the roster for a couple of years. How was your entree into the Fusion? And was it Doug? Was it other people? Was it sort of, how did you sort of, if you will, fall into the situation?
Yeah, I knew Doug from his days with Adidas. I was coaching at Indiana University where I had played. Pretty high profile collegiate program, still is to this day, actually. And
no question.
Doug was the head of Adidas soccer. And so we all got to know each other. And Doug then went on and kind of moved out of soccer for a little bit. If I remember right, he was involved in like Kobe Bryant's deal. Like one of the first mega deals ever. And then he came back to his passion, which was soccer, and ended up being the GM down in, for Ken Horowitz's team. And when he realized he was going to hire Ray, I think he was looking for someone. He felt Ray was going to be tremendous in terms of marketing, his vision for it all. But I think Doug knew my background in terms of training players and felt that I would be a good match, I guess, with, I think as importantly, it's like Jimmy's saying, Doug, it was bigger than him just thinking I would be a match with Ray, maybe. It was that I would be a match with some of those players. And ultimately, it was pretty easy for me. And part of it is because we were talented. I said it in Joe's podcast. The notion that 2021 or 2001 kind of came out of nowhere is very unfair to a lot of players. There were some tremendous players with the Fusion right when I got there in 2000. Not all of them were around the following year, but they were talented players. There was no question. We made it to an Open Cup final. So, interesting, Tim, I read up a little bit on you. I was a kid who grew up watching the Chicago Sting, and professional soccer went away. I don't think I would have ever played at that level, though I was a pretty good player. But I saw a whole generation of my friends who were top level guys who never got a chance, unless they were on the 90 World Cup team or on the 94 World Cup team, or fortunate enough to parlay something in Europe. Or as Jimmy said, most of them ended up doing the USISL or playing indoor. And so when we got a league, I think to this day, we're all always kind of pinching ourselves saying, wow, we've really arrived. Well, back then, arriving was, like Jimmy was saying, getting paid $24,000 and telling me how many bridges he would come over from Long Island to get to New Jersey when he first got his opportunity with the Metro Stars. It was, you call it a crime of passion in a way, by anyone who was involved in the league. I mean, other than maybe Valderrama or someone, no one was getting big money. I mean, I'm sure Landon Donovan to this day thinks about what he would make in today's MLS compared to what he made when he was coming through. And I know Jimmy feels that. I know there's a lot of, and I'm sure there's a lot of former NBA basketball players and NFL guys in the early years that probably know that same feeling.
Yeah, I was gonna say the parallels are all the NASL and even ASL conversations, and even MISL to some extent would it's almost like you arguably are the modern day pioneers, right? Because it's the same kind of dynamic, really. I mean, out of the wilderness comes a new top Division I pro league after an absence of almost 10 plus years, right? And yeah, you have to make those decisions and or sacrifices and or chase the dream for that one last time. I mean, Jim, to your wife, to your credit, your wife is probably smarter and savvier with a long-term perspective on life than maybe you were at the time, because you probably would have been filled with regret, right? But it's not an easy decision, because there's life and then there's the dream, right? And this sounds like a partial dream. It's like, we'll give you the dream, but you gotta subsidize some of it, right?
Right. And even at that time, my wife was pregnant when I went over to preseason. She was ready to give birth. Literally, the day I arrived home from preseason from Italy, she went into labor. I mean, and these are the differences with the players from now to the players of my generation is we really had to chase the game. We had to really chase it. Now they don't have to do it, which is perfect, which they shouldn't have to. But we really, even pickup games for ourselves to train. Like, so for example, in the off season, we all played out the Rough Riders, me, Giovanni Savarese, Chris Armas, Kevin Anderson, all these players. We would meet down in Hoda Bavarian Soccer Club on Long Island, and we would train in the snow just because we wanted to, we had to really train on our own in the off season, so, I mean, it's just all those little things, but, it was what was required, and we did it. We didn't complain. That's not true. We complain. All players complain, but we get through it. And, that's what it takes. And it's, you can't, for me, I wouldn't have it any other way.
Jimmy complained every day in practice that I couldn't count to 6. That was the start of our training sessions, was Captain Jim Rooney and myself having a little word about how the scoring was going to go today.
Well, listen, one of the things is our job was every day. And the funny thing is, you think about it, it was me and John. Ray called me into the office every day, and I just look at John, and I get it because where he was sitting, I'd get to see him first, and I'd gauge him and see if he was quiet. Then I knew one of the players, something happened, someone didn't come home, so there was a little trouble. I gauged a lot of. So me and John, even after every game, we went off by ourselves and we had a beer afterwards and had a beer outside, just me and him, just talking about different things, moments. But we used to play when we trained. I would train and we'd go for a couple of laps, and then I'd say to the boys, "Are you ready?" And I'd let John know we're ready. And then we play a game, mostly half field, and it was blackjack, 21. And the idea was just possession. Every time your team passed it to the other thing, and John could not count. And he'd miss a lot of the passes. So that's why. And it wasn't just me. It was probably 22 guys or whoever lost, the 11 who lost.
That's hilarious. I guess whatever it takes to kind of get through. All right. So, John, actually, maybe Joe, maybe you can help us infrastructure-wise, because before we get into sort of further anecdotes here, we've mentioned Doug Hamilton, who I think it's important to sort of suss out here, was essentially the general manager for the bulk of the time on this team. But I also want to bring in two other dynamics to this, and maybe this will help sort of engender a few more memories and thoughts of your perspectives of this at the time. One is the chairman, Ken Horowitz, essentially is the owner operator, which was the term in Major League Soccer, right? Single entity, which, was not a new concept, but I think MLS was sort of modernizing it and burnishing it and trying to be judicious as a business model to do so. And the other is the stadium involved, the former and then renamed or refurbished Lockhart Stadium. Right. Maybe some of those dynamics, Joe, to kind of sort of frame this for listeners who may be a little ignorant of these 4 or 5 years of the Fusion's existence.
Sure. So in 1998, Ken Horowitz bought or it was actually before that, to start in 1998, bought a MLS franchise. So the league had 10 teams, and then Miami and Chicago came in to make it 12 in 1998. Ken paid, I think it was $25 million for a MLS franchise, which at the time, had he entered in as an original, would have been $5 million. And so he was very passionate about having a team and having a team in Miami. And then the original plan was for the Fusion to play at the Orange Bowl in Miami proper. There was a bit of a dust up between the powers that be in Miami and Ken. And so the decision was made. Ken mentioned he always had a backup plan, and that backup plan was Lockhart Stadium. But the problem was it would not be up to sort of MLS's standards from a capacity standpoint. So I think it had 8 or 10,000 that it sat at the time. And so they sort of retrofitted it to seat up to 20,000. And really, Lockhart Stadium, in that sense, became the first stadium which was expanded, conditioned, created, whatever you want to call it, to be soccer specific. Now, it wasn't built to be soccer specific. That was the original Crew Stadium in 1999. But Lamar Hunt did come to Lockhart to get an understanding of what Miami did in order to make it perfectly compatible for soccer, and took those learnings into building the Crew Stadium in 1999. So Ken Horowitz, owner-operator of the Miami Fusion, decided to bring soccer back to Lockhart Stadium, and it really continued the storyline within South Florida soccer of the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, where Ray Hudson was a prominent figurehead, bringing it now forward into the 90s and then early 2000s with Ray Hudson as well. As Jim mentioned, he was community relations manager, community manager, announcer, and then later becomes the head coach. And so the Ray Hudson, Lockhart Stadium, these storyline beats continued from NASL and into MLS. And just for an additional bit of grounding for folks, the Miami Fusion was only in existence for 4 years in MLS, 98 through 2001. And then that was it. There have been other teams that have been contracted in MLS since then. Tampa Bay, Chivas USA. There's teams that have been relocated, right? So Houston Dynamo were relocated, San Jose Earthquakes at one time. But the Fusion were truly for and out. And it's what's unique about it is they went out on top. 2001 Supporter Shield champion, dominant team, went to the 2000 US Open Cup final before that. And then that was it. And a lot of people speculated about why did the Fusion fold? Was it poor attendance? No. Was it this, that, or the other? No. And when it boils down to it, I did an episode with Gabe Gabor, who is still employed with Major League Soccer to this day. And we discussed the fact that at the time, MLS as a league was bleeding money and they needed to cut costs. Don Garber came in 1999, was the commissioner, and said, we've got to stop so we can grow. And so the decision was made to have some additional investments within the league to be able to sort of stem the blood, as it were, the green blood, and then grow. And then it got to the point where the decision was made to fold 2 teams. Original discussion was to be Dallas and Tampa Bay, because those were the 2 league-owned teams that didn't have an owner. And then Lamar Hunt came in, swooped up Dallas. Ken didn't want to stay with Miami, couldn't find a buyer for Miami. And so the decision was made for Miami and Tampa Bay to be done. And that was it.
So let me, and then like, if this is a 50-point toss-up question, right? So give me the background on Ken Horowitz, right? So in some respects, sort of the, the first outside, if you will, versus the original cabal that sort of got things up and running under Mr. Rothenberg in 96. What was his story, and why was he so, I guess, quick to look for a sale? I get the sense from what I remember and what I read that he was kind of the pauper of the bunch, maybe, or maybe he wasn't as well funded, perhaps, beyond the $25 million franchise fee, which, by the way, at that moment, right, that time, one of the first 2 expansion franchises, that was a pretty hefty and ballsy amount to kind of put up against something like this. I mean, blind faith or whatever, but it sounds to me like he didn't have the finances to kind of be there for the long haul.
Well, as Gabe tells it, and I think it's been covered as well in a couple of different entities, but it got to the point where the decision was made to continue the league from the billionaire standpoint. So we're talking about Anschutz, we're talking about Hunt, right? We're talking about those levels of guys, and others were millionaires. And I'm not being a bit flippant with say millionaires versus billionaires, but it was a decision on we could fold this league or we could keep it. And the way to keep it is by investing more money. And when you had invested as much money over the last 4 years as someone like Ken Horowitz had, and he was, I believe, the founder of Cellular One, just from a understanding of where sort of the money came from. When you have the perspective of, I put a lot of money into it. Yes, the 2001 season is successful and people are finally coming. It was a decision of, I don't know, is this a sunk cost fallacy at this point? Am I just going to keep continuing and to contribute money? Is this not going to grow? And as we know, the memory of the NASL was still fresh on a lot of people's minds on whether or not this thing called Major League Soccer would indeed grow to the heights that it has now 25 years later, or 22 years later at this point, because 2001 to now. Yeah.
Well, no, and plenty of big four sports
exactly
knobs that were kind of almost rooting for it to fail again. Right.
Right. Exactly. And so it did get to the point. I don't want to say Ken did not have the funds to stick it out. I do think it became a harder decision when you don't have sort of the portfolio like a Hunt or an Anschutz to be able to make sort of that longer decision. And it does become a, sink or swim right now type of decision, kind of thing. So that's a bit. So yes, to answer your question, it was finance related. But I do think, at least the stories that I've heard, there was an earnest attempt to keep it going from Ken and from Ken's party. But it was a decision where it got to the point where the funds weren't necessarily there and no one was coming in to fund the fusion.
John, Jim, do you remember sort of, I'm curious as to what your sort of day-to-day life and lifestyles were, both on the field and off the field too, the fans and the relative small crowds and the fact that you're in truly in the middle of South Florida versus being closer to Miami or all that kind of stuff. I mean, did you ever get any senses that there were that the financial situation of this club in particular or was potentially in question, or even hints of the league being a bit wobbly during your player, or were you just concentrating on the job at hand, and that is playing, conditioning, nutrition, travel, all that kind of stuff?
Well, from a player's perspective, we were aware of what was going on. We didn't dive deep into it as players because we came around as a team with the coaches and everything. There's nothing we can do about it. So the best thing we can do is go to work, do our thing, do the thing that we're there for, and really make it hard for them to make that decision. And that was our main focus. To say to me right now, did you know that, if you lost, because I've heard many different things. I was not aware of that once it lost. I knew it was a possibility, but no, I mean, we just went about, listen, we can't do anything about it anyway. Let's go and do our thing and see what happens. And, that was a player's perspective because we couldn't change it.
And just to add on to what Jim's saying for context for folks, Jim's referencing the 2001 playoff semifinal against the San Jose Earthquakes, where it really came down to, there was a lot of rumors and discussions, even at that time, of whoever loses might be the team that ends up getting folded. And so there was sort of a little extra incentive on whether or not to win, at least from certain parties. And so it did end up, the Fusion lost, the Fusion are gone, just to clarify that.
Didn't help.
And Joe and Tim, some of it as well. I mean, I wasn't privy really any more than the players. I think Ray and Doug protected all of us so we could go about our jobs, which I thought was very special of both those men. We didn't need to concern ourselves every day because we were the type of group of, I was always with the players. It would have self-consumed us, unfortunately. Luckily, we just got to go out and enjoy what was just a wonderful period of time. I look at that. I was involved for 18, 19 months, and it was the friends I have, the connections through that team. Jimmy and I still speak. When people ask me, well, who was the captain? I said, Jimmy Rooney was the captain. And I introduce him as such. And I've coached a long time, and there's very few other people that I introduce as my captain. Well, Jimmy Rooney's my captain. That's who he is. And there were a lot of things like that. But I look back on Ken, and that was one of the first kind of tech bubbles happened. I believe it was in 99 or 2000. And so here was a man who had done very well for himself up until that point. Now he's in the league of the Anschützes and the Lamar Hunts. He thinks he's arrived, and on paper, whenever that tech bubble hit him, it hit him hard, I'm sure. And, now we've been through a few more of these cycles with the stock market, but I think that one hit him in a way that Anschütz and these other guys could craft. They could ride it out. Ken didn't have the same level of wealth, and he had put in 25 million for the franchise, which was much more than most of the guys had put in. And I think as the cash calls, and I don't know, I'm speculating, I think as those cash calls added up, which very shrewd business, you look at what Don's done for the good of the league over an extended period of time, but it was tough on Ken Horowitz. I met the man, I believe, once in my 18 months I was there. So, he was just an owner to us. We knew who he was in that sense, but we weren't friendly with him. Ray and Doug, that was management to us. And I think Jimmy would say that, from the player's perspective. I don't know, Jimmy, how many times did you ever meet Ken?
Yeah, I mean, we'd see him at the games every so often, but he wasn't around, like John had said, as such an owner like Lamar and all those other guys. So, but again, I don't know too much. He's a nice man, and like I said, the business side of it, that was just a different level for me at the time, for sure.
How about this stadium? I mean, because the other thing is that he also put $5 million extra into, I guess, the plan B, right, which was the rehabbing of Lockhart Stadium, and then try to summoning up the friendly ghosts, I guess, of the strikers in the past, and trying to stir up some memories of those golden times. I mean, it was a rickety sort of thing, but man, that place rocked back in the NASL days. I must admit, I was actually at the second ever Miami Fusion home game against the Chicago Fire. That was the Chicago Fire's first ever game. Actually, I traveled down to it, and I was I remember the week leading up to that game, they were talking about how they were hoping the paint was going to be dry for when that game was going to start. But I was flabbergasted. I mean, I had seen Lockhart Stadium games, when Ray was running on the field and stuff. And it was, it was a high school stadium, maybe with a couple of extra pluses. But I was pretty impressed. I was, from the scoreboard and all the way through. I mean, it was not, top of the line by any means, but it felt cozy. It felt comfortable. It felt soccer centric. And yeah, you got the initial glimpses of what, this was even before the idea of soccer specific stadium became a term, right? But there's a lot of undue credit or non-remembered credit, I think, that should be given to what he did, especially in the short term, to get that thing as a viable, benchmark perhaps for what a soccer specific stadium could be.
I mean, no doubt about it, because that field that we played on, it was one of the best fields in the league, and as a player,
I remember that too. Yes,
yeah, we were able to play the way we wanted to. There was no excuses, so we loved it. And again, it was an atmosphere of, it was really tight. When we got going, and just even when we started getting over midfield, playing, putting balls through, and 5 and 6 players running into the box. I mean, the crowds, it was loud enough, and it's just like anything else, unless you were there at the games. It was a very good crowd. And like you said, Miami, you know, we never really thought about it. I mean, Fort Lauderdale to me was the best place to play, and we loved playing there as players. Yeah, okay, I mean, my first season, I mean, I loved playing at Giant Stadium. Obviously, the facilities there and everything, but you know, what I mean, you see the place now. I mean, obviously, I would have loved to play there for that, but at the time, I mean, it was like a middle of the road facility. You know, it wasn't the worst, but the field was excellent, and that was the big thing, and they put a lot of money into that because it was perfectly flat. I mean, completely flat. And, you know, we'd play in Columbus and the ball would roll off because of drainage and stuff in the old stadiums. But this field, you could play. There was no excuses. So we loved it.
How about the fans? And I guess that from an outsider's perspective, having never been to Lockhart Stadium before that game, you know, it felt like it was kind of, I don't know, off the highway, off the beaten path. There wasn't a whole lot of sort of commerce around it and stuff. I don't know if that's just the South Florida kind of layout, right? Because I mean, you know, Hard Rock Stadium is also off a highway too in Coral. I mean, did it matter, right? Did the Fort Lauderdale Strikers memory help or hurt or have no effect whatsoever? Did the name Miami turn off people to the fact that they were playing in Fort Lauderdale? And ironically, a situation we're dealing with now, again, with Inter Miami, at least in the short term.
Yeah, I think it's changed from now in terms of, you know, going to Miami. Back then, I mean, it was, you know, comparing that to now, like, for example, I'm sure every one of us watched Champions League, you know, and everybody, you know, the access to all these games. We didn't have that. As a matter of fact, after we played on a Saturday, we always came in and trained on Sunday. And most of the players who played, it was just be a short little session. But the players who didn't play, we stayed around and watched them. And then afterwards, we would go and watch the second game in a local pub just across the street. And we'd have an English breakfast, and we'd have a couple of beers, and then we'd go home. Some of us would go home, but we would end up going home. It was just a different time, you know, and you know it was very Florida-like, you know, the beaches, you know. I mean, we hung out when I first came down there, and Garth, you know, myself and Garth, we were always down at Fort Lauderdale Beach, always, and so it had a different type of lifestyle. But at the end of the last year, every one of the players in the MLS wanted to play for the Miami Fusion. Clint Mathis, every time, was begging me to talk to Ray to get him to go to Miami Fusion. And, you know, that says a lot right there.
Yeah, you know, Tim, as a former NASL guy, you know, fan, as you said, you know, growing up, I was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I used to go to Sting games all the time. I knew all about the Strikers. I had actually seen Ray Hudson play a couple times long before I ever got to meet the man and then work for him. Mm-hmm. They were a kind of semi-legendary franchise then as the Strikers, which I believe Jeff Rusnick did a nice job on one of the other episodes kind of talking about that. So there was this groundswell of soccer in South Florida, which I think Ken Horowitz just thought he would tap into immediately. But it's a sophisticated soccer fan in South Florida as well. Mm-hmm. Probably a little bit like Chicago. And you better be good, you know, and in fairness to Fire, you know, they won 2 trophies their first year. They were good. And everybody was waiting for the Fusion, you know, could they replicate anything like the Strikers? Because the Strikers had some really good teams and some really good seasons and some legendary players on top of Rocky Ray Hudson, you know, Nene Kubias and some of the other guys that played. And everybody was wondering. And then, you know, Jimmy shows up from New York and we pick up another guy, and there's this guy, and Diego Cerna comes back from his knee injury, and Ray's working the network to find more pieces of this puzzle with Doug. And all of a sudden, all these people that used to be Striker fans was like, wow, this is what we had hoped for in 98. we're finally seeing it in 2000. And maybe it took Ray being a strikers guy to say, you know what, this league's all right. It's not where the NASL is yet, but it's all right to be a fan of this league. And the next thing you knew, it just became like a snowball. It just, the players felt it, the fans felt it. Like it was just a unique little moment.
Tim, one of the things was the very first time. I mean, John mentioned the Fort Lauderdale Strikers had, Nene Cabillas, world-class players. And, I knew a Gerd Mueller. I was a Cosmo fan. I didn't like the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. And I used to tease Ray about that all the time. But you get to the point when Ray, with all those great players, we see, the world sees Ray's commentating now. But Ray was like that as a player to the fans there. He was the fan favorite. And let me tell you, when his first game, they announced the players, and then they announced Ray Hudson's name. I'm telling you, it was like a rock star came into the place. It was unbelievable. Even, we knew he was well known, but we were like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. And especially the younger players who really didn't know, they're like, oh man, so we felt it. Ray's energy that he brought, he just translated it to the players. But he was Ray Hudson in South Florida, and now he's, the magisterial Messi talker. He's the guy. That was every day.
I remember kidding him after I got to know him a little bit. It wasn't quickly. It was 4 or 5 months. And I said, Ray, do you have the key to the city? Like, as a mayor? And he's like, oh yeah, they gave me that a long time ago. That's who Ray is in South Florida. He's as big a sports personality. When he talks about hanging out with the Robbies, I don't think it was like typical player to owner stuff. I think it was more the way Jimmy was with us. He had a special place in the owners' hearts. And that's who he is down deep.
All right, what's this? 417 helmets. My goodness. Well, you've heard me talk about 417helmets.com, collectible helmets and more on this very show fairly often. Our pal Judd Lesher down in southwest Missouri, I think in the Springfield, Missouri area, if I'm not mistaken. What is it? 417helmets.com. Well, first, if you dig all of our great football stories and episodes of the past, and you'd like to commemorate some of them in mini helmet form, really cool, sort of literal, high quality, professionally, made materials, but in a mini format that you could put on your desk or put on your in your bookshelf or whatever it is, and just about every league that's ever existed, save from the NFL. We're talking XFL, old versions of the WFL. Remember the World Football League? How about various teams, both current and past, in the Canadian Football League? But also NCAA teams of yore and NAIA college football teams of yore. All of them and many, many, many more available for you at 417helmets.com. But that's not it. That's not it, friends. There's plenty more to be had. How about mini baseball helmets? Yeah, a whole bunch in the Negro Leagues. And yes, officially licensed by the Negro League Hall of Fame. You can get a bunch, and they're making more all the time. And by the way, custom helmets can be made too, both of the baseball and the football variety. You got your business, maybe a promotional thing you want to do for your company, perhaps your organization, you want to raise some funds, all that kind of stuff. Great custom approaches to both mini football and mini baseball helmets can be made at your command for you to enjoy and to sell or resell or give away. All of that and more. That's the more part at 417helmets.com. It's collectible helmets and more And we've got a promo code for you, too, for whatever you purchase. All of them, all of your purchases, 10% off all of those when you use the promo code GOODSEATS. Again, promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases at 417helmets.com. Thanks, Judd, and thank you all for listening and trying them out. And now back to our conversation. Someday we'll get Ray on, but in lieu of that, I think it's also important to remember, not only was he sort of a catalyst in 2000 and then certainly in the 2001 season, right? I almost hear it's almost like a wistfulness in both of your voices that if but only another season or two, right? I mean, not only did you win essentially, the league regular season title. There wasn't even a supporter shield at the time, but I mean, this was a team that was fun to watch. And frankly, I think, if I remember correctly, almost a spitting image of the head coach, right? Who, in many respects, almost willed certain performances out of players and stuff, right? And it's the thing that's lost on people, though, is that this was his first managerial role, right? It wasn't like he had a huge coaching pedigree prior to this.
That's correct. He was coaching a girls' youth soccer team. That was the only managerial experience he'd had before. And then after the fusion, he coached the DC United for a couple of years, and then that was it.
Yeah, no disrespect to the under-9 girls crowd, but
of course.
They were the Hollywood Wildcats.
There you go. There's a deep cut.
So I guess the question in there is how much of his personality, it sounded like a lot, rubbed off, and if you will, maybe filled in the gaps, maybe where the, shall we say, technical expertise wasn't fully there, or did it not matter?
Well, that's the thing. That's the big fallacy, about Ray. And, and as players, we knew what he brought to the table, but everybody thought of him as a rah-rah guy. And, he doesn't know even some of the coaches that I was friendly with on other teams. They're like, oh, you guys are doing well. Congratulations. But Ray, how's Ray? But he's not really a coach. And we were like, yeah, he is. And we took it personal because Ray knows the game inside out. I mean, and he's just putting the pieces together, and he knows how to tap into the player's mind. Yes, he knows how to motivate us. Yeah, he knew how to do that. But to actually talk about, he always said, oh, I don't get into the X's and O's in terms of training. No, he didn't. But let me tell you, he fixed everything that went on in that game. And, it's no accident we only lost 5 games that year. And I don't think as a player, he gets the credit he really deserves, because you can say, oh, it's easy to say 1 year, but we went to the Open Cup final. I mean, they built it, and it wasn't this, okay, we got lucky. All the players he brought in, Bish, Chacon, worked. Every single Chris Henderson, Preki, worked. Everyone, he brought Ivy the year before, he worked. I mean, everything that he did. And so, honestly, to be as players, we were kind of pissed off about what they used to say. So anything that we grabbed about that, and we took it personal for Ray, because Ray knows the game inside and out, and I'm sure John will tell you that.
Yeah, and to kind of follow up on Jim's point was, I heard the same things, in the soccer world. I was a coach. I'd come out of the collegiate game, oh, Ray, he's just a promoter. Yeah, he's like one of those English managers. All you have to do is spend 3 minutes listening to him commentate on a game today, and exactly the vision that he told me that I needed to try to help promote with his players. And players and coaches, I've been an assistant coach for over half my career. All you want is the head guy to have an idea, whether he's demonstrative every day or not. He has his vision, and then you can go about, and he was tremendous in terms of delegating first of all, most importantly, to the players. That's why they loved him. He delegated to the players, but he also delegated to his coaching staff. He didn't get up in our kitchen. He told us how he envisioned the team playing. And then he wanted us to have as much fun as the players were going to have. And I tell you, I've had two different environments, Indiana University, having worked for Jerry Yeagley, legendary coach. It's that same feeling. But anyone who thinks it was by luck with Ray is completely underestimating who he is. And I think he's shown it now with his announcing over the previous 20 years. He's a visionary in terms of the game. And he was able to get that over to Jimmy, the captain, and all these pieces that he brought in. And that's why they loved him. And it was the bottom of the roster to the top of the roster. The players just loved him. I mean, they might not have liked everything he said or contractual things that happened, but they loved him and they loved playing for him. That's the ultimate criteria of a great coach to me.
Yeah, I think they call that a player's coach, right? And that says something, especially if you have a team, that believes and can believe in the system, or believes in the idea, or believes that it's us versus the world, or whatever, whatever the obstacle or the challenge that sort of might be in front. And that it speaks incredible volumes, right? Because that can be a catalyst for a team that is lacking or could be literally just energized and brings even the top class players together in something beyond just the individual talent on the field.
Right. And I could give you two quick instances that we did as a club that no other club team has done. Back in those days, we would go to preseason, and usually we go for 6 weeks. New England always went to Italy for 6 weeks, and then you'd end up in Mexico, like 4 teams like us, Dallas. We'd be at the same facility, and we go down to Mexico, and they'd only have one phone. So all the players would be trying to call their families, one phone. We look at each other, no con. So it was never great traveling away. So Ray come up to me and says, preseason, do you think it's big to go away? Like, I'm like, no, we go away there because of the weather. We have the weather. So we never went away for preseason. We didn't have to deal with all that stuff. So he stopped that straight away. He's like, listen, we're not going to go away. And it wasn't a cost cutting thing. It was like, it really is the players. We were just like, well, this is great. We'll work harder. And then mostly
I thought it was because they didn't have Waffle Houses in Mexico, Jimmy.
It could be that too. And it just got to the point where even the first week of preseason, he said to us, listen, he said to me, he said, look, we have to get our numbers. We got to run this certain fitness we have to do. But after that, he goes, do we really need 2 sessions a day? And I'm like, no. He says, listen, we're going to try this 1 week. We're just going to go full hard, but no slacking. Put it in the first day. And we're like, okay, as players, those little challenges work. He gave us these challenges and we worked hard. We never had double sessions after the first week. Everybody was double sessions. I mean, and that's good coaching management. And as players, we respected that. And we were like, man, this is, we never had that before, and wow, we have a choice. He let us have input. And, even as small as that, we just felt we had a voice. And 2 things that were very important. We didn't go anywhere. We had the weather. We didn't have to go anywhere. We're in South Florida, so, I mean, he gets credit for that for sure.
I remember one time Pablo Mastroeni was pretty young at that point. And, he hadn't been to the World Cup yet. And Pablo was, he'd run a little bit hot and cold at times, but he was having just one of those perfect training sessions. And, Ray complimented him about 3-4 times and practice ended. And I remember Ray kind of walked over to me and he said, He said, "What'd you think of Pablo today?" I said, he was unbelievable, you know." And he's like, "Oh, he's brilliant. He was brilliant." He goes, "You know, John, the next time he's that good, I want you to just send him away with like 20 minutes left in training." And I said, "Send him away." And Pablo loved to train. He was young. He was really hungry. And Ray said, "Yeah, just tell him to go in, take a shower, get his juice, whatever, get his cologne on and wait for the team, let them come in a few minutes after him, make him feel special when he trains like that." And to this day, I think about it all the time. I mean, that's brilliant man management. That's sports psychology at a really high level. But that's how he thought about things too. It was always a positiveness, like, oh, if someone's being great, let him have the easier day then, right? I just thought it was amazing, some of his anecdotes that he used over the couple of years I was with him.
How about some of the players not already mentioned that kind of stand out? I mean, I think there are two players in particular that probably most people remember most vividly because they were constantly scoring goals and leading the team and occasionally the league. That's Diego Serna for a bunch of years and Alex Pineda Chacon, who the last season, 2001, lit it up. Was this kind of like was the team like solely dependent on these guys, or was this? It almost feels like those were the players that kind of, I think, perhaps embodied what most people wanted the franchise to be: exciting, attacking, and on occasion, beautiful. The beautiful game.
Jimmy, I'm not going to steal your thunder, but let me just say this just quickly. We were so talented in so many different positions. I mean, I'll just say the starting lineup very quickly. Ramondo in goal, Carlos Llamosa, Pablo Mastroeni, usually Tyrone Marshall, and Ivan McKinley across the back. Bishop, Preki, Jimmy Rooney, Chris Henderson, with Serna and Pineda Chacon. I mean, just think for a second, and that's, you're talking about guys like Kyle Beckerman eventually was on the roster. I mean, but that starting unit, there were so many goals. Every locker had goals in it. I mean, we could score from anywhere. And so, yes, what you see is Serna and Chacon. But the moment you fell asleep on Jim Rooney, the ball was in the back of the net because he was showing up on the penalty spot. Well, if he was crashing the box and he didn't get rewarded for it, the ball was running on to Preki or to Chris Henderson on the other side. I mean, we just came at you in so many different ways, and the balls that Bishop would slip through to Jimmy or up to those front runners. And it's Ray's belief, and I think it was my belief, and I think why I got along with him in this group of players, is the notion of true total football, not this position total football that everybody's talking about. Truly positionless in many ways. And that's what we were doing. And we had the players to do it, and they bought into it. And it was a thing of beauty when done really in that Cruyff way of doing it. Not, people are talking about total football today. And I'm like, actually, it's the antithesis of total football. It is position specific football. Can be very successful, but it's completely different than what initially was total football. Anyone could play anywhere. I would take Jim Rooney in a heartbeat, and he could be a center back on my team. And he could definitely be a center forward as well, because he was a total footballer. And we had a whole team like that, and they loved doing it.
I always maintain one of the strongest part of our team was our bench, because we had guys like Greg Simmons while they were young, which I think helped too. Lazo Alavanya, Jeff Billick. I mean, Jeff Billick came in. Bish was having an issue with his ankle, and he got an operation for 2 weeks. He was out for 2 weeks. Jeff Billick slides in, and we didn't miss a beat. And then at times Alavanya would come in, and Lazo Alavanya was an unbelievable player. I mean, and these are the guys we were playing against. I mean, Jeff Billick, was like, I mean, he would go in and tackle with his own mother. I mean, he was tough little guy, but these guys held us to task each and every day. And, there was times where, their frustration, you know, we got into a couple of pushing matches and stuff like that to competitive, but after in the locker room, we'd laugh about it, especially me and Jeff Billick. We played the same position, and me and Jeff Billick went to the same high school. We grew up on Long Island. And although I think I was 8 years older than him, but what a player! And he came in, and then when Bish was back, it was just like, listen, he understood. He's like, listen, man, I enjoyed it, and that was the attitude that we had. And those players were unbelievable, as far as just being, if you want to call them our supporting cast, but they weren't that. They came to work each and every day.
So in that season, right? So many things went right. It just seems like everything was just magically in place. And aside from not sort of ultimately culminating with the MLS Cup, right? I mean, a very successful season, and almost sort of a validation, I guess, of 4 years of hard work and a year and a half, or actually almost 2 seasons, I guess, of Ray in charge and the team sort of gelling and coming together and stuff. And then dramatically, I guess I guess you can't say it any less so. It all comes to a crashing end. And I got to think that had to, I don't know, be just kind of a shell shock given just how many good things happened that season.
Definitely. I mean, it's a thing where, you've heard it during the, throughout the season at certain points in time. And I guess it's sort of like until you really hear it and see it to believe it, you don't really know. And we only had 4 days. Shock, isn't the word really. It was devastation, really, and then we had to basically 4 days later, now I'm on another team virtually, from the announcement to, because preseason was starting after that. And I'm looking at 4 of my Fusion teammates in New England Revolution locker room. I mean, it was just so difficult to really believe we weren't together. And, and even now at times, and even during the season, we'd see each other during the season after the games. And we just look at each other, and we didn't even say anything. We just looked at each other, and words that need to be said. I mean, yeah, we were happy still playing, but man, we missed being together as a team, and just everything about it, really.
And Tim, it be remiss not to as well, it was 6 weeks after 9/11. I mean, the world changed too. And I say this, and I mean absolutely no disrespect to any of the other players or any of the other people involved in the league. The toll it took on the Miami Fusion 9/11, because we were so intertwined with New York, even though we were in South Florida, from our owner all the way through to our captain, to our center back. I'm not sure all the other teams in the league got hit the way we did. And that's a really unfair thing to say to anybody who was in America right during that point. But our whole front office was from New York. Doug Hamilton was from New Jersey. We were flying to New York City the morning of 9/11. We then were supposed to fly on Wednesday. Our first thought is, well, we're not going to New York. We've got to go to DC. We've got a game 3 days later in DC. We had no idea, as anyone did at that point, what was really happening. And so you had the league making decisions. We were the juggernaut team. You had all this. We were the supporter shield. We were the hot. There were so many different dynamics going into, I think a lot of people say, oh, well, Landon Donovan just took care of you guys. I don't think it was that simple, by the way. if you look at the 3-game series.
You were tied to 2 games on aggregate. There was not an aggregate score, and you guys lost in extra time in the 3rd game, right? So it was a pretty competitive series.
Exactly. And it was a tough time on our front office and the league in general. There were so many. Joe and I got into it, 5 points and now the playoffs thing is going to be the same this year or something. I don't know. I haven't seen it all the verbiage of it, but there were changes made on the fly that just happened to happen. They had to happen. There was nothing, Garber had to make decisions. Are we going to finish the league? Are we going to have a playoffs? Are there going to be any more regular season? But I think if we would have kept going for those next few weeks, I think we would have had no problem finishing off.
I think it's an interesting question. I really haven't thought about it until you guys sort of put it in this perspective, because I look at the schedule, right? I mean, your last regular season game, a 3-1 defeat of DC at home, was on September 8th, right? So 3 days later, obviously, the horrific events happened, and then the MLS playoffs were starting, a little later on that month, right? And it threw threw everything, not just sports, right, into a tailspin, right? But it's hard to look back and say what if, right? But you wonder. I mean, you mentioned it before, you hinted at it before, that there were whispers of a need to right-size the MLS ship at this point in some way, shape, or form. And it did seem like there were ideations, at least, of a bit of a contraction play as a way to affect that, to start the beginning of that process, right? But I got to think that both of you, all 3 of you, frankly, and me, now that I think of it, have to give some thought to, you wonder if something like that hadn't happened, would Miami have maybe been able to justify coming back? Or do you think it was maybe a fait accompli regardless of the events of 9/11?
I'll just go ahead.
Go ahead, Joe. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think what's interesting, I've been doing a lot of thought ever since doing this series, and something that I think is helpful. We're recording this in 2023, and the COVID pandemic is still pretty fresh on a lot of people's minds. And you hear a lot of discussion from businesses and frankly, your neighbor down the street who talks about reevaluating their life in the wake of such a like life pausing moment, right? And so to have a different type of tragedy happen on 9/11 in 2001, I think definitely put a lot of people's thoughts into perspective as to what their plans would be. And so I don't know if the outcome of the Fusion season in the playoffs would have been any different. And I don't know if the Fusion wouldn't have folded. I do think it's worth asking the question, did those in charge sort of reevaluate maybe what was important for them at that time when everything stopped and then resumed? I think it is an interesting question.
Yeah, it's tough, when those things are kind of brought up, in the sense that, for me personally, what 9/11 did was, my older brother was working on the pile afterwards. So, and he worked over 500 hours on the pile. And during that time, he obviously the world was, engulfed in that, and just talking. And my brother was a pretty tough guy. And he just talked differently. I noticed a change in him, and it was just obviously, going back to those times. And eventually 3 years later, unfortunately, he passed away from 9/11 respiratory issues. But during those times, just hearing, it was, that John brings it up, I don't really remember much of that being affecting me, but I don't know. And, but it did, hit us hard in terms of, Carlos Yumosa used to work in the World Trade Center when he first came to this country, and he knew many people there. And, my cousin, I mean, so everybody knew somebody there, but it's just it was a difficult time. And, I just remember doing what we had to do. I mean, that's all. During that time for me, our focus was going on. We didn't know. I remember we didn't know when it was going to start up again. I'll tell you that. That's what I remember from that. So, but yeah, it was certainly,
I
altered
was
a
in the
lot of things.
office. I was in the office getting money from Nick Megaludis, who was a former assistant coach, but Nick's a great guy, New York ties as well. And the first plane hits, and we're sitting there and we're watching the TV, and he's giving me the money to give to the guys on the road trip. And I'm thinking it's a beautiful day, which every day in South Florida is, but it was supposedly a beautiful day in New York. We were going to go to Central Park and play soccer, tennis, and the guys loved going to New York because Ray let them experience it. The guys wouldn't even come home on the bus with us back to Jersey. They would hang out for a couple more hours in downtown and then be ready. And then we were going to DC. It was always a big deal to play DC. And then it was not only we're not doing any of that, we're like every other American wondering what the hell's going on in the world. And then thinking, well, we got this unbelievable soccer team. Are we ever going to get to showcase them again? In the jealous little world that we all live in, right? In our own little cocoon. And I'm sure, like Jimmy's saying, I mean, he had family stuff going on, really heavy stuff going, but everybody just wanted to kind of get back out there too. I mean, I remember when we finally started training, what was it, Jimmy? Maybe 4 or 5 days after when they finally said we could train again.
Mm-hmm.
And Yamosa brought his kids, and it was different. There was no question. It was different. And, that's what we were all dealing with.
Yeah, that may be a conversation to have with Doug Logan and Don Garber, right? Who kind of, would obviously have been in the driver's seats, or at least in, knowledgeable about sort of the situation before, arguably during and after, that sort of led to the decisions that were made. But in hindsight, right? It clearly something had to be reset with the league, and it's just unfortunate. I hear it in your voices, right? Aside from just the unspeakable tragedies, and Jim, I'm sorry for the personal connection to that, but it's just unfortunate that a team that had done so well would have to be, not have a chance to sort of validate itself and go to the next level and continue the next journey. It's just these, you could excuse a team that had not been doing well as being ripe for pruning, but not this one, right?
Right. And you said, what would have happened if we won? And that's the big thing. I don't think we could have won because of the referees, but that's another story. But we get to that point, during that time, that's the thought process. But now, it's 25 years, and look at the league. I mean, my imagination couldn't even create this league of what it is as today. As far as, we could talk about Don Garber making decisions. Listen, Don Garber, it's hard to argue about him making any mistakes at this point, I mean, of course, we're involved in it. Obviously, it affects our livelihood. It affected our livelihood, our trajectory, just as, for each and every one of us, but, unfortunately, just looking back, we were the ones. And, when you build something like that and you finally, it's hard to get teams to get it together. And then when you're a player and you see it, slowly, you're like, wow, this is working. Because we've all been on bad teams, and you see, you're like, okay, this is it. You could basically see where we're going or how far we can go. But this team was different, and that's the real shame of it. And I think everybody feels the same way, even the fans, more importantly. And I had my daughter and Jeff Cassar's daughter were little girls hanging out there, half the time we didn't even know where they were after the games because they were in the crowds taking our kids. I mean, that's how close we were to the fans. I mean, they came to our birthday parties. I mean, my daughter had a 2-year-old birthday party. Every one of the players showed up. I mean, and that's rare. We didn't have that in MetroStars, and so when you see that and then that's all gone, that's the real hard part of it as a player. You're like, man, it's so hard to get together and to create something as good as that. And look at it. I mean, listen, every pro soccer team tries to create a team that Ray created, on the field. And, but at the end of the day, look at MLS. It is incredible. And Don Garber has done an amazing job.
And, I think that this is what ends up, I think Jim did a great job encapsulating it. This is what has frustrated me about sort of the legacy of the Miami Fusion up to this point has been every time you read about the league and the history of the league, with a few exceptions, the Miami Fusion are a bit of a footnote in, the Tampa Bay Mutiny and the Miami Fusion were contracted in 2001 by MLS, and yada, 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 we move on. And I think the Supporters Shield win forces people to remember them. But I think what's more important as a league like Major League Soccer continues to grow and evolve is to not forget about the foundation laid by a team with such a truly historical legacy as the Miami Fusion. We're talking about Garth Lagerwey, you talk about Chris Henderson, talk about Nick Raimondo, you talk about Ray Hudson, right? All of these people who have gone on and impacted the game of soccer in such a fundamental way that we've got to continue to tell these stories and keep a repository of them so folks can go back and listen and realize, wow, this team did more for Major League Soccer than I even realized. And we get to 29, almost 30 teams in 2023 because of a lot of the sacrifices that folks made 25 years ago.
Totally agree. And I guess that sort of leads me to the last sort of question, which we're all kind of dancing around, is so what of the legacy? How much, how little has MLS recently or at all remembered? And in particular, Inter Miami, where arguably that legacy is most or should be most easily or conveniently remembered. How much embrace has there been? Or has it been a hands-off kind of thing with a desire to not remember that 4-year false start, perhaps? I hate to call it that, but I mean, I could imagine MLS wanting to whitewash things because MLS has done that. And, what do you guys think? I mean, how good or I mean, I don't even know how much Inter is even remembered or given, any sort of background love to this former franchise, aside from bulldozing the previous stadium and building a new temporary one on top of it.
So I think,
go ahead,
Joe.
Go ahead, Joe. You have to. I was going to say, Joe, do you want to take it first?
Yeah. So I'll lead with this. So I recently spoke with Chris Henderson, who former Fusion player, now in the executive spot within Inter Miami, and I asked him about. And this is a little plug, right? By the time folks are listening to this, the episode will be out. You can go check it out wherever you stream podcasts. There's a little plug for you. But when I was speaking to Chris, I asked him about moving from Seattle to Miami and what that process was like for him. He said it was a no-brainer. I had to come back to Miami. I had to come back and make it full circle because of how he was impacted by the community, by the team, by all the intangibles that he experienced in that 2001 season. It meant so much to him. He wanted to come back and continue that legacy. Now, that was Chris's perspective, is Chris's perspective. And I think from a branding perspective, I think it's understandable for a team to want to start anew and start a bit fresh, as Inter Miami did, without nary a mention to the Fusion, except in the name of Lockhart, right? However, this is now the 4th year that Inter Miami has been in existence. The Fusion lasted 4 years, and what I have been able to find out through conversations is the ice is thawing. There's a bit more of an understanding of an acknowledgement of honoring what has come before, the Strikers, the Fusion, and now Inter Miami, and perhaps an opportunity maybe in the future to continue to honor what came before. So I think there is an appetite now that continues to grow to honor the legacy. I do think it would have been hard. I think folks would have been hard pressed to bridge that conversation up to now. And I feel I would like to take a small bit of credit in feeling like folks listening to this show, this podcast that we're doing, and hearing people tell the memories and talking about what it means to them, and mentioning people like Doug Hamilton, right? And mentioning people like Garth Lagerwey did and Chris Henderson did about how they left such an impact on them. I mean, Jim and John talked about the fans. The fan community is the same. It's only continued to grow. And so when people start to hear these stories and hear the passion and hear the appetite and see the fans reacting to these stories, I think it gets people thinking, you know what? Perhaps we haven't been able to connect with the community as much as we could. So hopefully more to come. I do think MLS is getting more and more comfortable embracing the historical legacy of American soccer, whereas before, I don't know that always existed.
Yeah, before you guys chime in with your final thoughts on this, it's given that the Miami Freedom Park, I guess, is on its way now to being built after a long and torturous process, right? It almost seems almost logical, right? I frankly had not thought about layering in the Strikers before then as well, and which we've seen with MLS embracing Portland and Seattle's heritage, and to a lesser extent the San Jose Earthquakes and some of that kind of stuff, right? Which is great because it pulls all the way back. It's authentic, right? Makes things more rooted and maybe people less cynical about this still relatively new league, only 25 or so years old. But to do it perhaps at least in what'll probably be the final season or two of Drive Pink Stadium, where the Lockhart Stadium used to be and where the current stadium sort of sits, it would be a really cool idea. Maybe we're breaking some news here or some ideas here to do that next year, right before they move to Miami Freedom Park, and complete that circle or that original intent where the original Fusion franchise was going to be located in the first place nearby in the former Orange Bowl. I don't know. Maybe I'm just dreaming here, but
no, I think that's a good dream. And we hope that those ideas continue to flow, because really, I can't thank Jim and John enough for continuing to share their stories and continue to provide other names of folks to share their own stories, because it's been incredibly fun and enriching. And for someone who aspires to be a soccer historian like myself, it's a great opportunity to capture the fabric of American soccer history and document it for folks to listen to. But truly, I think the legacy of the Miami Fusion has made the foundation of Major League Soccer the juggernaut that it is today. And maybe that's a bit of a bold claim, but all you have to do is run back through that starting 11 that John mentioned earlier, and you see exactly where those people are today, what impact they've had in Major League Soccer. And without those contributions, you don't have a lot of what you have now. And without most of those guys passing through Miami, it's likely they do not go on to have the careers that they end up having. I know I mentioned Garth, but Garth was going to law school, and he would not have come back into an MLS executive position had he not had that connection with Doug Hamilton. But this is an opportunity to allow folks to appreciate one of the greatest histories of Major League Soccer, especially the 2001 season, and appreciate when they're watching MLS now and they're watching Inter Miami at Drive Pink Stadium, right, or on Apple TV, that they can appreciate that the Miami Fusion played total football, right, to lay the foundation for a team bought by David Beckham to come in and maybe even perhaps have Lionel Messi come in and take soccer in Miami to that next level.
John, Jim, do you feel a connection to the Fusion? Excuse me, to the Fusion. Of course you do. To Inter Miami, or not?
No, I don't. And the thing I don't understand about it is, this. I'm not going to pretend I know about the marketing and the strategies of why, or not. But if you really understand the players of that generation, there is nothing more than we would. I mean, why do you think we fought to do all this stuff, to get paid, to have a great league, to possibly have, I wanted this league the way it is, to have an opportunity as a young kid, which I didn't have, to play for Inter Miami and to have that pathway straight up. I mean, every one of the players of my generation that played during that time, that's what we were striving for. So from my perspective, personally, this is my personal opinion, I don't know why. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm not asking, but just to say, hey, I mean, I was initially in a couple of meetings, but that was from the initial, when they first were going to come down here. And they kind of, the initial group didn't really handle it all that well when McDonough came down, in my opinion. So and all it would take, I would love to promote the team, but never asked, never did anything. And that's the one thing I don't understand from, I would be the first one there to support the teams. I mean, this is what we all strive for. This is why John came into the league to coach, because, these new facilities are incredible for us. And so, Chris is there now. It's a little different. And I think Joe's right. The timing of it, I guess they wanted to kick off without us, because I don't know, maybe it just opens up other people to think, well, I knew they had to get out of the gate really quick. And unfortunately, the club itself, they were hit with COVID, all that. It was tough for them at the beginning. So use all the help you can get. I mean, I'm ingrained into this community. I coach down here. I mean, this is our market. That's the one thing I never understood, is not to give me any special treatment, but, hey, you involved in a club, Jimmy, okay, that's great. Let's go. You help us with tickets. You don't have whatever. I was never asked anything, and we're the soccer people. So hopefully that changes down the line, but it hasn't happened so far.
John, what do you think?
To kind of follow up real quick with Jimmy's point, I mean, I'm up here in Chicago. I don't live in South Florida. I obviously still speak to Ray. I still speak to guys from the team. But I think if you think about it for a second, that the youngin' on the team was Kyle Beckerman. He was a Generation Adidas 17-year-old that we brought in the middle of this project. You want to say the elder statesman, I used to call him my uncle. He tried to call me, I was his grandfather, was Preki. And then you look, and I think maybe MLS has gotten to the point that these stories of a guy like Jim Rooney on the pay, traveling all the way to New Jersey from Long Island. I mean, my parents lived in Long Island for a while. I said, Jimmy, you make the trip every single day from Long Island to New Jersey? He goes, yeah. I said, why didn't you move there? He goes, with what money? He goes, I was newly married. He goes, I was just trying to play soccer. And then you look at, Brian Dunseth, who's a big time announcer, who's followed in Ray's footpath, Carlos Shimosa's coaching, Chris and Garth are GMs, following Doug Hamilton's footsteps. I mean, there's so many stories from that Fusion group, guys that went on to play in the World Cup after being a part of the Fusion. And just a lot of, I think the general soccer fan in America should have an interest in that, just the same way I love to hear old stories about the NASL guys, because I was a kid and I remember watching some of those players. So when I meet one of them, I remember meeting Giorgio Canali, and it was like such a big deal to meet the guy. Like, oh my God, there he is in the flesh. Well, the same can be said about Jim Rooney and Carlos Schimosa, and look at the career Kyle Beckerman had. He, I mean, it was a unique group of guys pulled together by Doug, God rest his soul, who's no longer with us, and Ray. And I know a lot of them went on to do great things at other clubs, but even Chris Henderson admitted he needed some full circle in his life to get back to South Florida. Well, maybe we all do. And maybe the fans of the Fusion need us to maybe show up one more time again, because it got taken away from them. And that's what sports is really about. As much as we, the coaches and the players, it's what Ray knew ultimately, it's entertainment. Jimmy was an entertainer. The whole Fusion team, they were entertainers. And there's a group of fans that still, they're trying to be Inter Miami fans. I don't think they've quite figured it out, because they were Fusion fans and it got taken away from them.
Yeah. And, it also comes down to things like, where is the supporter shield? Arguably it needs a place to live. I mean, there's a retroactive continuity aspect to it because there was no quote unquote supporters shield in 2001, but the effect is the same, right? The Fort Lauderdale Strikers, essentially in 1977, I believe, won the equivalent of the regular season title, what would have been called, today's supporter shield as well. Those are two things etched in South Florida's pro soccer history that could physically live in the current stadium, the new stadium, at least as a reverential touchstone. It just seems obvious to me. Now, obviously, I'm biased. Joe probably fits in the same sort of mold here. And we've been doing this show for almost 7 years now, and I always rail around the same idea. It's like, this is history. It was something. These are some things that happened, and there's a continuity there. And you've seen MLS in fits and starts warm up to it when perhaps commercially convenient. This is a situation where I think it's inevitable. And I would say the same for all the other franchises out there too. I mean, Dallas with the tornado, and all these. There's nothing but good things that can come from it. I understand, Garber and his the pot shots that he gets, right, for sort of growing the league and getting that 30th franchise and $500 million for San Diego. And you can't deny that kind of level of success. However, to do that with a blind eye to all the things that came from it, and I hear this from all the NASL guys I talk to for sure, who are humble and genuine to the core. And I hear the same in you guys too. But it's hard not to be a little miffed because you do want to see it succeed, but you don't want to see it sort of whitewashed either, because that's not the way it happened, and frankly shouldn't be remembered as the way it happens going forward. So
right, and we don't need a plaque on the wall or anything like that, even if it's a quiet little thing, and it's just to be a part of, like I said, where there's a lot of coaches, and we could bring people together, and we want it to succeed. We're soccer fans, we're football fans, and we would do anything to make it work. But look, they have their plan. I'm not going to pretend. I'm not bitter about it. At this point now, it is what it is, right? So we're big boys, and we move on from here.
Thinking from a business lens, I think there's one sort of a few different virtues that they always teach you as far as a business sense, right? One is don't align yourself with a failed initiative or a failed brand. And you saw MLS very intentionally distance themselves from NASL. And it truly wasn't until the fans voted in the name of the Seattle Sounders in 2009 that MLS went, oh, maybe we should start embracing some of this. And I think what's misunderstood, and I kind of feel like this is what John and Jim are getting to, is that the principles of business, as far as not associating yourself with something like, say, the Miami Fusion, which doesn't exist anymore, to do that, you're not quite understanding the true passion behind someone who's a soccer fan, and really also even someone who's a South Florida soccer fan, because the fan base transcends those sort of traditional ideas and wants to embrace historical artifacts, historical notions, to be able to celebrate and fold it into the overall legacy of the team. You are starting to see people like FC Dallas on the captain's armband. They've got the logos of the Dallas Tornado and the Dallas Burn and FC Dallas, right? So there's a little bit of a gentle nod. You're starting to see, like, we've got Seattle Sounders, Portland Timbers, Vancouver Whitecaps, San Jose Earthquakes. We've got these classic names. It's time. It's time to continue to embrace the history and not to say, oh, well, this failed, so this is going to fail too. No, to say this was the foundation. Let's build on it. Let's embrace it. Let's appreciate it. And let's celebrate it.
All right. Our thanks to Joe and to John and to Jim and those memories of the Fusion from Miami. And again, the podcast that is ongoing. It is called 25 for 25. And it is the, I think you could accurately say, the background story of the Miami Fusion through many of the folks that lived through it. It is available wherever you can find podcasts. And I highly recommend it. Download them all and listen to them all and enjoy to your heart's content. You can follow Joe on Twitter at D Talks Joe. D Talks Joe. You can also follow the adventures of this podcast, the Miami Fusion 25 for 25, he says, on Instagram at Miami Fusion Pod. And while you're online, why don't you go to our website, for goodness sakes, and check out all of our great episodes beyond this one at goodseatsstillavailable.com. We post every single episode there, some imagery, and if there's ever any wares to be had, like a book or a movie or whatever, you can conveniently click those links there to those, and have them all at your fingertips. If you'd like to send us some email, you can do that too at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. It's been a long week, friends. And let's see, if you want to follow us on social media, we're available in those places as well. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. On Facebook, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. And on Twitter, you will find us at Good Seats Still. What else? The best way, of course, to ensure that you get every episode of this show is to make sure that you follow us, or you whatever you do, you subscribe to us. There's a whole bunch of different verbs, I think, now as to what that means. But whatever you need to do to put a season or a subscription into your device of preference, make sure that you find Good Seats Still Available and you put that into your infrastructure. Why don't you? And let's see what else. Our thanks, of course, to the great Jerry Payne Audio Excellence. Thank you, sir, for your knob twiddling this week. And we just want to mention that the clip that began this show comes to us from the actual MajorLeagueSoccer.com website. It was from about 9 years ago, I think. You could enjoy the entire episode. It's from MLS Insider, episode number 11. I don't know if it's on the site itself. You can find it on YouTube. But in addition to that clip, it's a wonderful video remembrance of the team, both pre and during the Ray Hudson era. So we thank them for that clip as well. And we thank you, of course, for listening this far. And more fun and excitement coming your way next week, and a whole new topic. God knows what it'll be, but you'll just have to tune in, won't you? Take care and be safe, everybody. Bye-bye.